See, I promise this is the last time you will hear the word category from my mouth. I promise. But you see, I can't lead you this far and then just leave you hanging. We discussed every different type of category, but there's a last one. There's a last one. We are discussing watches in category by era of philosophy. We're going to break it into 3 parts. So please, I beg. Last time, categories. What Talk with Francis and Francis. Let me rush this one. Okay, so in the all other series we've discussed different types of categories. The last one was by style, where we talked about dress watches, sports watches, and tool watches. So now another category or subcategory we really need to trash out, because you may come across it while you are in your collecting journey, is the category based on era of philosophy. Let me explain that. The eras at which the watches were being made, they kind of tell different stories. So we're going to break this down into 3 categories, subcategories, if that was a thing at all. And we'll take it as the first one will be the vintage watches, the second will be neo-vintage, and then the modern watches. So when you talk about a vintage watches were made in an era where watches were made as tools first and then accessories second. Watches were made for what particular use case they were made for. They were military watches made for people going to the war. They were dress watches for the aristocrats to wear with their formal outfits. Now the time era is usually between the 1940s to the 1980s. Now there's still a debate whether watches from the 90s are categorized as vintage or neo-vintage, but I think we're in 2026. The 90s, as much as I remember it just like it was yesterday, but the 90s are quite a long time ago. Songs from the 90s are categorized as vintage, so watches from the 90s I think should be categorized as vintage. Now, the whole concept of vintage watches is something that I personally I'm definitely no expert in. I don't even want to say I'm new to it, because I don't even dabble in it. Not because I don't necessarily like them, but more because I do not understand them. So I guess I'm on the front row of this class just like you guys. Now, but I get the appeal. I understand when I talk with my friends about it, I totally understand why some people go for vintage. First of all, there's the character of the watch. A vintage watch, it just has character. You'll be hard pressed to find somebody wearing the same watch as you, because they're very few to find, and then some of them are really collectible, and then even if they're not so collectible, like I say all the time, my most valuable watch is the watch I inherited from my father. It is a vintage watch, but it doesn't cost much. It's a 1963 Seiko. So there's the character behind the watch, the patina of the watch, to see the wear and tear that the watch has gone through over the years, and the basic history of the watch. These are things that are not tangible and you can't really put a price to it. But there are some trade-offs that you have to consider when you are thinking of buying vintage watches. First of all, if you are using it for like active, like a tool watch, they usually tend to have lower water resistance. And then, they have fragile parts, because they're not from a modern era where there was technology and, there were a lot of new things. So the parts are a bit fragile. And there is, as the issue of servicing, because you have to service with somebody who really knows or is familiar with the movement, because some of those movements are most of them are not made anymore. And there's the tricky part of authenticity. In the watch world, there's something we call Franken watches. A Franken watch is like a monster Frankenstein of a watch, where you can have an original case with either a fake movement, or the movement has parts from different other things and is jumbled up together to become a Franken watch. Now, that is mostly common with vintage watches, because sometimes at no fault of anybody. It might be a watch from the 40s, has been serviced in the 60s. One part was not made anymore. It was changed by something that could do the work but was not an original part, reserviced in the 80s, and then another part, and so that happens. So the authenticity can be debatable sometimes, but so you need to be sure of the trusted source you are buying your vintage watch from. Now, the basic characteristics of vintage watches that you have to think about. First of all, we already mentioned that they were very specifically built for use case. So most of the time, the dress watches were proper dress watches. The tool watches were proper tool watches. So a lot of times you find that the cases were smaller, maybe from 34 to 35, sometimes from 32 diameters. And so they had smaller case sizes. They had very, very thin profiles. Very thin profiles. Some of them had acrylic instead of sapphire crystals. Some people, that might take a lot of scratches, but like I said earlier, that adds to the character of the watch. And then, a good thing for some proper enthusiasts is there are no modern parts in it. So you won't find the silicone hairspring, for instance. It will have, proper old school, real watch parts. There's also this issue of, like I said, the servicing, the parts, so those are some basic characteristics of a vintage watch. But all in all, vintage watches, I think, are really, really cool. They tell a story, they have great history, and there's the exclusivity factor of when you wear a vintage watch. Now, there's this whole thing about vintage watches appreciating in value. It's 50-50. There are some cases where some vintage watches are really coveted and some vintage watches totally tank in value. Now, I remember the one vintage watch that I've always looked into getting for myself was or is the Oris Big Crown Pointer Date. I tend to like the vintage models way more than the modern ones because they had so much character on the dials. Very small case size, which might throw me off a bit, but they're nice. Now, those don't appreciate in value. They, you could get them, if you can get a good one, you could get them for, next to nothing. But the Rolex Daytona, popularly called the Paul Newman, which is a mid-60s Cosmograph Daytona owned by Sir Paul Newman, is a classic example of where a vintage watch holds value. It was sold at auction in 2017 for about $17 million, and the prices just keep going up for that particular model. So in some cases, it's 50-50 and whether they hold value or not. I said it before, my most valuable watch, not by price, is a vintage watch because of the sentimental value that it holds to me. So I always preach that we shouldn't even look at watches as asset classes and buy them for value, but 17-point-something million is worth thinking about. The new vintage watches are in an era right between the vintage and the modern. You could say that they are the bridge between both worlds. And, the way I like to look at it is these are the watches that were made in an era just when the vintage watches or the watchmaking was turning from vintage to modern, but never lost its soul. Now, you would find that collectors love new vintage watches because, first of all, like I said, it's the best of both worlds. It's the watches at that time were less hype driven and more connoisseur focused. They had character. Now, case size wise, by this time they had gotten a bit bigger, but still within limited range of from, let's say, maximum of 40 millimeters. They still are very much in circulation and have more serviceable parts, so that's why I said it's a perfect bridge between both. Now, there are some of those watches that are really sought after. Panarists will understand this. There is a real crave for pre-Vendome Panerais. Let me explain that real quick. Panerai as a watch brand was bought over by Vendome in 1997, which is now called the Richemont Group. And any of the watches that were made by Panerai before that acquisition are generally revered as proper, truer to the Panerai DNA than the post-Vendome era watches. And that's classic neo vintage. I remember the Patek Philippe reference 5040 was a chronograph, which I think was ahead of its time. It was a bigger case size, I think 42 millimeters, I'm not sure. And I remember that it was snubbed by a lot of collectors as too big, maybe too thick. And then later on in life, it took a whole new life of its own where collectors were scrambling for the few ones that were left in the market. Another classic example of neo vintage is the Omega Speedmaster from the mid-90s with the Hesalite, not sapphire crystal. Speedy collectors swear by those neo vintage models. So collectors love those. I like those. I think they really have, true time or era DNA to them. I think they're quite neo vintage watches. I think they're a sweet spot and they're quite interesting, and they also have a good story. And in a few years down the line, I guess the ladder pushes them down to vintage category as well. It's all crazy. The modern watches. Now, these are from the era of the mid-2000s till date. Modern watches. Modern watches are what we know today. It reflects our time, the social media influence, the technology influence, which kind of means that they are better, but maybe not necessarily true to tradition, which is not a bad thing. Purists would complain, but listen, it is 2026. It is a modern era. You have influencers marketing things. Watches today, to me, are more a statement piece, more of an accessory than a tool. There's this whole thing where we say, if you want to check the time, you probably check your phone first before you check your watch. So there's that argument. Now there's a stronger brand presence now. Watches are more brand driven. Like I said, this is the era of the influencer marketing, the era of social media. So you are pretty much bombarded. I'm sure in a few years down the line, there would also be a distinction from pre-COVID modern watch era and post-COVID watch era, because it's like night and day. For collectors who have been collecting watches way before COVID times, you guys know what I'm talking about. Now, there are some characteristics of the watches that you would see. Sapphire crystals have become a norm. A lot of brands are now using less scratch resistant, like ceramic bezels for the watches. There's higher water resistance. There's a lot of focus on lume. There's, higher power reserve. Like I said, it reflects the technology of today. And yes, there was a total philosophy shift from the watches being tools to there actually being more lifestyle equipment, for lack of a better word. You see this with I will get crucified again, but yes, you will see this with the Richard Milles, you see this with the Patek Philippe Nautiluses. You find that a lot. I hear this with a lot of my friends who are Patek Philippe collectors, where they still prefer the older references from Patek Philippe, even the older Calatravas, the older Aquanauts, to the newer ones, because they feel maybe hip-hop culture has taken away the essence of the watches. I don't necessarily agree. This is the time we are in. These are the watches that, will I say, depict the era at which we live in. I've embraced it. I've been collecting watches from the early 2000s, so I have a lot of neo vintage watches. I have a lot of modern watches. I like them equally. Now, that's my opinion. What's your opinion? Which of these eras do you guys belong to? Are you a vintage guy, a neo vintage guy, or a modern guy? Let's chat about it in the comments. This was actually fun, and like I said, I promise, no more categories. It was fun talking watches. Stay safe, guys. And of course, like, share, subscribe, means a lot to us, keeps the channel going. See you guys later.